you know the difference between a home and a gallery. A home is where you live, but a gallery is where you are displayed, frozen in a moment of someone else's choosing. And right now, I am sitting in the shadows of a room that doesn't belong to me, clutching a gold key that cost 6 women their lives, just so I could tell you the truth before the curator finds me. My name is Janet, and for the last decade, I wasn't a wife. I was item number 7, a living statue in a billionaire's private collection of human perfection. Greetings, my dear friends. Before I share this heartwarming story with you, I want to ask for a small favor. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps stories like this be heard. And drop a comment letting me know which state or city you're listening from. It would warm my heart to know how far my voice has traveled. Get comfortable. Happy listening. I thought I had beaten every statistic when Julian Vance looked at me, a 60-year-old woman who had spent her life working for every penny, suddenly swept into a world of silk sheets and private jets. But I didn't realize that Julian didn't want a partner to grow old with. He wanted a masterpiece that would never age, never argue, and never change. I remember our first anniversary in the glass wing of his estate, overlooking a Mediterranean sunset so vibrant it looked like a painted backdrop. When he handed me a velvet box that felt far too heavy for a gift, inside was a necklace of black diamonds that felt like a cold collar. And as he clipped it around my neck, his fingers stayed there a second too long, and he didn't look into my eyes. He looked at the way the light hit the stones against my skin, whispering that I was finally complete. I laughed it off back then, thinking it was just the way eccentric men loved, but I didn't realize that complete was his word for a finished product. A statue he had finally polished to his liking. The first red flag wasn't a fight. It was a door in the West Wing that didn't have a handle on the inside. A door the staff refused to acknowledge, and that Julian brushed off with a smile that never reached his eyes. It wasn't until I found his private ledger that the floor fell out from under me. It wasn't a bank statement. It was a catalog with my wedding photo and the words, item number 7, condition, flawless, value, priceless. But it was the 6 pages before mine that stopped my heart. 6 other women, 6 other pieces of his life, and next to their names was a single, terrifying stamped word, archived. That was the night I realized the luxury I was flaunting was nothing more than the gold plating on my own coffin. And as the realization settled into my bones, I heard the faint, rhythmic humming of a hidden elevator coming from behind the library walls, signaling that the curator was heading to the one place I was never supposed to find. That word, archived, didn't just sit on the page like ink, pulsed with a cold, predatory life of its own, a silent promise that in Julian's world, a masterpiece only has 2 states, on display or under glass. And as the heavy silence of the library pressed against my ears, I knew I was looking at a map of my own disappearance. Ever have a moment where the air in the room suddenly feels like it's been replaced by freezing water, making every breath a struggle against a tide of pure terror that threatens to drown you right where you stand? That was me, standing in Julian's sanctuary with that ledger in my trembling hands, looking at the faces of the 6 women who had held my title before me, all of them diverse, all of them beautiful, and all of them erased from the map of the living the moment Julian decided they had reached their peak. I stayed up that night, the gold-leafed clock on the wall mocking me with its expensive, rhythmic ticking, watching Julian sleep like an angel carved from marble in the moonlight, knowing now that he was a graveyard masquerading as a man who promised me forever, while secretly measuring me for a shelf in his basement. I had to know where they went. So I spent the next 3 weeks playing the part of the doting, flawless wife, smiling for his cameras and wearing his diamonds while I mapped out the electronic hum of the estate's hidden nervous system. Was behind the climate-controlled wine cellar that I finally found it, a keypad hidden behind a vintage bottle of Bordeaux that led into a white, sterile corridor that smelled like a high-end medical wing rather than a home. What I found wasn't a dungeon, but something far more haunting. 6 reinforced glass doors, and behind them, the women weren't dead in the way you'd think, but preserved in cryogenic suspension units, sleek and silver, held in a perpetual state of perfection. Because Julian couldn't stand the thought of his collection aging or gaining a single wrinkle. Each pod had a plaque with a name and an expiration date, the day they showed the first sign of human imperfection. And as I stood there, my breath fogging the glass of item number 6, I realized my 60th birthday wasn't a celebration to Julian. It was the day I was scheduled to be put on ice forever. He didn't want a partner to grow old with. He wanted a gallery of statues that would never argue and never leave. And as I looked at the 7th pod, already polished and waiting for me with the jewelry he'd already picked for my eternity, the elevator behind me chimed with a cheerful, terrifying ring. The curator was coming down to check on his investments, and I was trapped in the one place a piece of art is never supposed to see if it ever hopes to breathe again. The chime of that elevator felt like a physical blow to my chest, death knell echoing through the sterile white tiles of my future tomb. And in that split second of pure, unadulterated panic, I realized that if Julian caught me here, my archiving wouldn't wait for my birthday. It would happen tonight. I scrambled backward, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, looking for any place to hide in a room designed for total visibility. But as my hand brushed against the cold metal base of item number 6's pod, I felt something that didn't belong in this world of smooth surfaces and perfect finishes. It was a small, jagged piece of tape stuck to the underside of the display plaque. And as the elevator doors began to hiss open at the far end of the hall, I ripped it away and ducked into the narrow, dark gap between the cooling vents, just as Julian's polished leather shoes stepped onto the floor. I held my breath until my lungs burned, watching through the slats as he walked with terrifying grace toward my future pod, his fingers tracing the glass with a tenderness that made my skin crawl more than any act of violence ever could. He looked at the empty chamber not with sadness, but with the hungry anticipation of a child waiting for a new toy to arrive in the mail. He whispered something I couldn't hear, a soft, melodic murmur to the frozen women, before turning on his heel and leaving, his presence lingering in the air like the scent of expensive cologne and ozone. Once the silence returned, I collapsed against the wall, my fingers fumbling with the scrap of paper I'd pulled from the pod. And under the dim emergency light, I saw the frantic, scratched handwriting of Sarah, the woman who came before me. It wasn't a plea for help or a suicide note. It was a set of coordinates and a single, chilling sentence. Jewelry is the key. The diamonds are the eyes, and the vault only opens for a heart that still beats. My mind raced as I looked at the heavy bracelet on my wrist, realizing for the first time that the gifts he showered me with weren't just chains. They were sophisticated tracking devices and audio bugs that had been recording my every breath since the wedding. Sarah had figured out how to bypass the system before he froze her, leaving behind a breadcrumb trail that led directly to the heart of Julian's digital empire. But as I stood up to leave, I noticed a tiny, blinking red light on the base of my own empty pod that hadn't been there before. It was a weight sensor, and it had just registered my presence, sending a silent alert directly to Julian's phone that his item number 7 was currently inspecting her own final resting place. The walk back to the master suite felt like a funeral procession where I was both the priest and the body. Every step on the cold marble floors echoing the ticking clock of a life I no longer owned. I reached our bedroom and scrambled into bed, clutching the silk sheets to my chest as if they could protect me from a man who owned the very air I breathed. And when the door clicked open minutes later, I feigned sleep with a desperation that made my muscles ache. Julian didn't turn on the lights. He just sat on the edge of the mattress, his weight shifting the bed just enough to make me feel the gravity of his presence. And I could feel his gaze roaming over me like a jeweler inspecting a flawed stone. "I know you're awake, Janet," he whispered, his voice a low, melodic vibration that carried the chill of the archive floor. "And I know you've been wandering in places where the light doesn't reach." I opened my eyes to see him silhouetted against the moonlit window, his face a mask of terrifying calm that made me realize the loving husband I had married was just a costume he wore to put his prey at ease. He didn't yell, and he didn't threaten. Instead, he reached out and took my hand, his thumb tracing the pulse point on my wrist where the diamond tracker sat. And he smiled, a slow, predatory baring of teeth that told me he wasn't angry I found the archive. He was excited that the game had finally reached its final stage. He told me that curiosity was a beautiful trait in a woman, but in a masterpiece, it was a sign of impending decay, a crack in the porcelain that needed to be sealed before it shattered the whole work. For the next 3 days, the mansion became a psychological chessboard where every meal was a test and every conversation was a minefield. He would leave the archive ledger open on the breakfast table just to see if my hand shook when I poured the coffee, or he would play recordings of the other women's voices over the house speakers, a haunting chorus of perfect wives who had all eventually failed his tests. I realized then that he wasn't just waiting for my birthday to freeze me. He was trying to break my spirit first, to see the light go out of my eyes, so that when he finally turned the key in that glass pod, he would be preserving a shell that no longer had the will to scream. But what Julian didn't know was that Sarah's note was tucked into the lining of my corset, a jagged piece of hope that gave me a reason to keep my heart beating fast and loud. And as we sat down for a silent dinner on the third night, I noticed he had added a new setting to the table, a single, empty chair placed directly between us, with a small, silver nameplate that sent a jolt of ice through my veins. Because it didn't say Janet, it said item number 8. The sight of that empty chair for item number 8 was the final slap that woke me from my stupor. Julian wasn't just planning my end. He was already shopping for my replacement while I was still breathing his air and eating his food. I realized then that I couldn't afford to be a victim for one more second. So that night, while Julian was in his study finalizing the acquisition of his next victim, I locked myself in the dressing room and took a magnifying glass to the black diamond necklace he had given me. Sarah's note had said the jewelry was the key, and as I tilted the heavy stones toward the light, I saw it, not a flaw in the carbon, but a microscopic, etched serial number that matched the frequency codes in the back of the archive ledger. These weren't just stones. They were the physical overrides for the house's biometric locks, designed so that Julian could move his pieces through the high security wings without triggering the alarms. My hands shook as I realized that the very chains he used to mark me as his property were the tools I needed to dismantle his empire from the inside out. I spent the next 4 hours huddled in the corner of the closet where the cameras couldn't see my hands, using a heavy steel nail file to carefully pry the master diamond from its setting, feeling like a thief in my own home, As the stone popped free, with a sickening metallic click, I knew I had to be precise. If I tripped a single silent alarm, the archiving process would begin instantly, and I would be nothing more than a frozen memory before the sun came up. I crept toward the primary server hub, hidden behind the velvet tapestries in the hallway. My heart thundering so loudly, I was sure the walls could hear it, and pressed the diamond against the secondary scanner. The light turned from a hostile red to a welcoming, surgical green, and the heavy steel door hissed open, revealing the glowing blue heart of Julian's digital fortress. I wasn't just looking at security feeds, I was looking at the central nervous system of the entire estate, including the life support controls for the 6 pods in the basement. As I began to feed the coordinates from Sarah's note into the override terminal, the screens began to flicker with images of the frozen women, their vitals pulsing in rhythmic, glowing lines that proved they were still in there, waiting for someone to break the spell. But as the progress bar for the system sabotage reached 40%, the overhead speakers crackled to life with Julian's calm, terrifyingly amused voice, informing me that he had been watching the server's power draw from his phone, and that he was already standing outside the door, holding the manual override key that would lock me inside his gold-plated cage forever. The sound of Julian's voice coming through those speakers didn't just chill me. It felt like a heavy shroud being draped over my living body, a reminder that in this house, even the shadows were on his payroll. I stood frozen in front of the glowing blue servers, the stolen diamonds slick with sweat in my palm, as the heavy hydraulic bolts of the door clicked into a permanent lock, sealing me inside the very brain of his digital monster. "Janet, my love," his voice echoed, sounding more like a disappointed father than a husband. "You've always been so inquisitive, but you've forgotten that a masterpiece is meant to be admired, not to touch the machinery." I watched the monitor as he appeared on the security feed just outside the door, looking impeccable in his silk robe, holding a small remote that controlled the life support flow to the archive pods below. Gave me an ultimatum that shattered what was left of my heart. I could either delete the sabotage sequence and walk out of that room to accept my archiving with dignity, or he would cut the power to the pods right now, letting the 6 women before me slip from their frozen sleep into a permanent darkness. My hand hovered over the execute key, the weight of 6 lives resting on my tired, 60-year-old shoulders, while Julian watched me through the camera with a predatory glint in his eyes, enjoying the godlike power he held over all of us. He thought he had me trapped in a moral paradox, believing my conscience would make me weak. But he underestimated the rage of a woman who has spent a decade being treated like an inanimate object. I looked at the screen showing Sarah's vitals, the woman who had left me the map, and I realized that they weren't truly living down there. They were just trophies in a madman's attic, and their only hope for peace or rescue was for this entire system to burn to the ground. With a scream of defiance that tore through my throat, I didn't delete the sequence. Instead, I slaved the mansion's cooling system to the main power grid, creating a massive electrical surge that would fry the locks and the preservation units alike. Room began to fill with the smell of ozone and scorching copper as the servers groaned under the strain. And I saw Julian's face transform from smug amusement to a mask of pure, unadulterated fury as he realized I was willing to destroy his entire collection, myself included, just to strip him of his power. Monitors exploded in a shower of sparks. The door's magnetic seal failed with a thunderous bang, and as the emergency red lights began to swirl, I realized the gold-plated cage was finally cracking. But the predator was now loose in the dark, and he was no longer interested in preserving me. He was coming to break me. The darkness that swallowed the mansion wasn't the soft, natural dark of a bedroom at night. It was a heavy, artificial void, smelling of scorched silicon and the metallic tang of a dying empire. And as I stepped out of the server room, I realized that the luxury I once envied was now a high-tech labyrinth designed to trap me. My diamonds, the very stones that had been my tracking collar, were now the only source of light I had, casting a cold, flickering blue glow against the marble walls as I moved toward the service stairs. Every floorboard that groaned and every hiss of the failing ventilation system sounded like Julian's breath on my neck. And I knew he wasn't just chasing me. He was playing with me, using his intimate knowledge of this house to herd me like a panicked animal toward a dead end. I could hear his voice echoing through the hollowed-out corridors, not shouting, but conversational and calm, reciting the dates he had acquired each piece of his collection, as if he were reading a bedtime story to a child. "Janet, you're scratching the finish, my dear," he called out from somewhere above me, his footsteps a rhythmic, terrifying counterpoint to the thudding of my heart. And a damaged item loses all its value in the eyes of a true collector. I ducked into the kitchen gallery, my hands fumbling along the cold granite counters for anything I could use as a weapon. But my fingers only found more of his expensive, curated items, crystal carafes and silver platters that felt useless against the psychological monster hunting me. I remembered the coordinates Sarah had left in the note, realizing that the only way to truly stop the hunt was to reach the archive and manual override the thermal vents before the backup generators kicked in and resealed the pods forever. I had to cross the Great Hall, a wide open space where the moonlight through the high windows would turn me into a perfect target. And as I crouched at the edge of the shadows, I saw the red laser of his custom security override tool sweeping across the floor like the eye of a hungry cyclops. He was standing on the mezzanine, silhouetted against the shattered remains of his digital kingdom, looking down at me with a look of such clinical detachment that I realized he didn't even see me as a human being anymore. I was just a broken vase he needed to sweep away. I took a breath, clutching the jagged glass shard I'd picked up from a broken frame, and sprinted into the light, knowing that the distance between me and the archive was the only thing standing between freedom and becoming a permanent, frozen resident of the West Wing. But as I reached the hidden door, a hand as cold as the black diamonds clamped around my throat, pulling me back into the suffocating darkness of his embrace. The moment Julian's hand clamped around my throat, the air in my lungs turned to lead, and the world narrowed down to the terrifying, clinical focus of his eyes, which didn't look at me with rage, but with the cold irritation of a man trying to repair a defective machine. He pinned me against the cold marble wall, his strength unnatural and fueled by a life of obsessive control. And as his fingers tightened, I could feel the sharp edges of the diamond necklace pressing into my skin, the very collar he had used to mark me. "You've ruined the aesthetic, Janet," he whispered into my ear, his voice a hauntingly calm contrast to the frantic drumming of my heart. "And I can't have a piece in my collection that refuses to hold its shape." But Julian's greatest weakness was his obsession with his own perfect design. He had spent so much time curating my appearance that he had forgotten I was a woman made of muscle and survival, not marble and silk. As he leaned in to deliver his final, condescending sentence, I didn't claw at his face or scream for a mercy I knew didn't exist. Instead, I reached up and grabbed the heavy, jagged black diamond pendant, the master key I had pried from its setting, and jammed it with all my might into the biometric reader of the security panel he was leaning against. I knew that the electrical surge I'd triggered earlier had made the sensors volatile. And as the diamond made contact, a violent arc of high-voltage blue electricity exploded from the panel. Channeled through the conductive gold setting Julian was touching, the shock sent a convulsion through his body, his perfect composure shattering as the current threw him backward across the polished floor like a broken doll. His expensive silk robe singed and smoking in the red emergency light. For the first time in 10 years, the predator was on the ground, gasping for air in a house that no longer recognized his voice as law. And I didn't wait to see if he'd get up. I used that precious second of his weakness to dive through the archive door as it hissed open, the air inside already beginning to warm as the cooling units failed. I looked back one last time to see him struggling to his feet, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred that no longer had anything to do with art or beauty. I slammed the manual override lever, hearing the heavy steel bolts slide into place with a finality that felt like the first breath of freedom I'd taken in a decade. But as I turned to the frozen pods of the women who came before me, I realized the surge hadn't just opened the doors. It had started a countdown on the emergency oxygen levels, and I was now trapped in a room with 6 sleeping ghosts and a rapidly thinning atmosphere. The silence of the archive was no longer peaceful. It was a suffocating, heavy vacuum that seemed to swallow the sound of my own ragged breathing as I stared at the 6 silver pods, knowing that the electrical surge had turned this sanctuary into a pressurized tomb. Red emergency display on the wall flickered with a haunting countdown. 8 minutes of oxygen remaining for a room that now held 7 living souls. And I realized, with a jolt of pure horror, that I couldn't save everyone at once without crashing the backup life support system entirely. My hands shook as I stood before the glass, looking at the faces of the women Julian had stolen from Time women who had once been doctors, artists, and mothers, now reduced to inventory in a madman's basement. I moved to Sarah's pod, item number 6, the woman who had risked everything to leave me that scrap of hope. And I saw her eyelids flutter behind the frosted glass as the temperature began to rise, her body fighting to claw its way back from the deep freeze of Julian's obsession. If I woke her first, she had the technical knowledge to help me override the main gate. But the power draw would almost certainly trigger a fatal shutdown for item number 1, the oldest and most fragile piece in the collection, whose pod was already hissing with a dangerous leak. I stood between the 2 consoles, the weight of a god resting on my tired, 60-year-old shoulders, realizing that Julian's cruelty had forced me into the ultimate curator's choice. Who was worth saving when the clock ran out? I looked at Sarah, then at the fading vitals of the woman in pod 1, and I remembered Julian's voice saying that we were all just objects to be sorted and ranked. If I chose based on utility, I was no better than the man hunting me from the other side of the door. With a cry of desperate resolve, I didn't follow the manual's protocol. Instead, I used the jagged diamond key to bridge the connection between the 2 units, forcing the system to share its dwindling power in a move that was as reckless as it was necessary. The glass of both pods began to retract with a synchronized, agonizing groan. And as the first hiss of warm air rushed into the units, I saw Sarah's hand reach out and grasp the edge of the frame, her skin pale, but her grip fierce. Behind us, the heavy steel door of the archive began to buckle under the force of Julian's industrial glass cutter, the sparks flying through the dark like angry fireflies. And I knew that waking them was only half the battle. Real test would be if these frozen masterpieces could still find the strength to stand up and fight the man who had tried to turn them into statues. The screech of the industrial cutter through the archive door was the sound of a nightmare finally breaking into the light. And as the last bolt of the heavy steel barrier gave way, Sarah's eyes snapped open with a clarity that told me she had been dreaming of this vengeance for every second of her frozen exile. She was weak, her limbs shaking as the cryogenic fluid drained away. But the look she gave me wasn't one of a victim. It was the look of a soldier who had finally found her weapon. I grabbed her shoulders, pulling her from the pod just as the center of the door collapsed inward. And for the first time, Julian stepped into the archive not as a curator, but as a butcher, his face contorted into a mask of cold, surgical rage that stripped away every ounce of his billionaire charm. He didn't see women standing before him. He saw damaged goods that had dared to defy their owner, and he raised the heavy, vibrating cutter like it was a scepter of his crumbling kingdom. "You've ruined everything, Janet," he hissed, the sparks from the dying machinery dancing in his eyes. "And now I have to clean up the mess before I start the collection over from scratch." But Julian had made the fatal mistake of believing that because he had frozen our bodies, he had also frozen our spirits. And as he lunged toward me, Sarah didn't retreat. She used her knowledge of the pod's hydraulic system to kick the emergency release valve at his feet. High-pressure blast of supercooled nitrogen erupted from the floor, hitting Julian with a force that sent him stumbling back into the path of the very laser grid he had installed to keep us in. He screamed a sound that wasn't human, a sound of pure, entitled agony, as the red beams sliced through his expensive suit, marking him with the same clinical precision he had used to judge our flaws. I stood my ground, my hand locked in Sarah's, feeling the strength of 40 years of survival surging through me as we watched the man who thought he was a god get tangled in the wires of his own heaven. We weren't just two women anymore. We were the beginning of a landslide that was about to bury the Vance legacy forever. And as the other pods began to hiss open behind us, releasing a chorus of gasping, living souls, I realized that Julian's perfect gallery was about to become his own personal hell. Room was filling with smoke. The oxygen alarm was screaming a final warning. And the only way out was through the man who had spent a lifetime making sure we never took another step without his permission. But as Sarah handed me a heavy metal oxygen canister, I knew the curator's time was up, and the collection was finally going to retire him. Air in the archive was thick with the smell of ozone and the heavy, sweet scent of thawing chemicals. But as the other 4 women began to spill out of their silver cocoons, coughing and gasping for the thin, smoky air, a new energy took hold, a collective pulse of survival that Julian could never have calculated in his cold ledgers. We didn't have time for introductions or tears. We only had the terrifying rhythm of the mansion's self-destruction shaking the floor beneath our feet, and the sight of Julian, momentarily blinded and howling in the corner, trying to reboot his ocular implants. I stepped forward, taking Sarah's hand on my right, and the trembling hand of item number 1 on my left, forming a human circuit of flesh and bone that stood in stark defiance of the cold, digital world that had imprisoned us. "Hold on to each other," I shouted over the roar of the failing ventilation. "If one of us falls, the house wins." We moved out of the archive like a single, multi-headed organism, a tactical living chain that navigated the pitch-black corridors by touch and instinct, using the flickering blue light of our diamond collars to map the way through the debris. Every time the floor buckled or security turret whirred to life in the ceiling, the woman closest to the threat acted as the eyes for the rest, a synchronized dance of desperation that saw us bypassing biometric sensors by literally pressing our collective warmth against the freezing scanners. We weren't just escaping a building. We were undoing the very concept of Julian's isolation, proving that the pieces he had curated for their individual beauty were 1,000 times stronger when they were blurred together by a common rage. We reached the grand staircase just as a massive explosion in the server room sent a shockwave through the marble, sending shards of priceless Greek statues raining down on us like stone hail. But no one let go. The grip of a woman who has been archived is a grip that can weather any storm. I looked back and saw Julian emerging from the smoke of the lower level, a dark silhouette holding a manual override flare, his voice cracking as he screamed for his property to return to their places. He looked pathetic, a small man trying to command a landslide. And as we reached the final set of titanium doors leading to the courtyard, I realized that the only thing keeping those doors shut was the weight of his ego. We were about to hit it with the force of 6 lives he had tried to steal. But as I reached for the handle, the entire security system went into total lockdown, sealing us in a lightless vacuum, just inches from the fresh air of the outside world. The sound of the titanium doors locking into place was a heavy, metallic thud that felt like a coffin lid slamming shut on our collective hope, leaving us huddled together in a pitch-black vacuum, just inches away from the scent of night jasmine and freedom. I could hear Julian's footsteps on the marble behind us, slow, deliberate, and chillingly confident, because he knew that the total lockdown protocol was his final, unbreakable cage, a master switch that only his heartbeat was supposed to trigger. You've reached the edge of the world, Janet. His voice drifted through the dark, sounding closer than ever, stripped of all its charm and replaced by a rasping, industrial hunger. But the world belongs to the one who holds the keys, and you are nothing but a guest who has overstayed her welcome. My fingers fumbled at my neck, grabbing the very last black diamond from my necklace. The heart stone, which Sarah had whispered, was the only piece with enough raw data to force a hard reboot of the entire estate's exterior shell. I knew that using it was a gamble of suicidal proportions. To trigger a manual override, I had to jam the diamond directly into the high-voltage emergency junction box, acting as a human bridge for the massive electrical current required to fry the titanium bolts. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as I felt for the jagged edges of the metal panel, the smell of ozone and burnt copper filling my senses, while Julian's shadow loomed large against the flickering red emergency lights. I looked at the 5 women behind me, their faces pale masks of terror and hope, and I realized that my 60 years of life had all led to this one moment of defiance. The chance to prove that a collection piece could be the very thing that burns the gallery to the ground. As Julian lunged forward, his hand outstretched to seize me by the hair, I didn't flinch. I shoved the diamond into the heart of the junction box with a scream that was half prayer and half war cry. Blinding arc of white-hot electricity surged through the stone and into my arms, the smell of my own singed skin mixing with the sudden, thunderous crack of the massive doors being blown off their hinges by the sheer force of the power surge. The world exploded into a chaos of light and sound, the recoil throwing me backward into the arms of the women I had fought to save, while the titanium slabs groaned and collapsed outward into the grass. We were standing on the threshold of the night, the air of the outside world finally rushing in to fill our lungs. But as I looked back through the smoke, I saw Julian silhouetted in the ruins, his perfect world in ashes, and I knew the predator wouldn't let us walk into the trees without one last, desperate attempt to to reclaim his property. The first step onto the damp, cool grass felt like stepping onto another planet, world where the air didn't smell of filters and Julian's suffocating cologne. But the victory was a fragile thing that shattered the moment we hit the tree line. We ran with a desperation that ignored the ache in our joints and the burning in our lungs. 6 shadows blending into the dark woods that bordered the estate. But just as the lights of the mansion began to fade behind the dense canopy, a sharp, searing heat erupted at the base of my skull. I collapsed to my knees, a scream trapped in my throat, as a high-pitched, electronic whine began to vibrate inside my own head. And I saw Sarah and the others clutching their necks in the same agonizing rhythm. Julian hadn't just given us jewelry as trackers. He had implanted a subdermal failsafe, a microscopic leash woven into our very nervous systems that triggered a localized neural shock the moment we moved beyond the estate's perimeter fence. Through the haze of pain, I looked back to see a fleet of silent, sleek drones rising from the mansion's roof like a swarm of metallic locusts. Their red optical sensors scanning the forest with a cold, mathematical precision. Julian's voice suddenly crackled through the hidden speakers in the trees, sounding distorted and ghoulishly amused, informing us that we were still within his geofenced territory, and that every step further would increase the voltage until our hearts simply gave up. It was the ultimate curator's trick. He didn't need to chase us if he could make our own bodies turn against us, transforming our flight into a slow, agonizing crawl back toward the cage. Women looked at me with eyes full of a new, crushing despair. The hope of a moment ago replaced by the realization that we were still his, even in the middle of the wilderness. But as the next wave of heat pulsed through my spine, I felt a different kind of vibration coming from the master diamond I still clutched in my scorched hand. It was a counter frequency, a steady hum that seemed to dampen the pain whenever it touched my skin. I realized then that the master key wasn't just for the doors. It was a portable jammer, the only thing that could sever the invisible leash if I could figure out how to amplify the signal before the drones pinpointed our exact coordinates. And Julian arrived to collect his broken assets. The agony in our skulls was a rhythmic, pulsing fire that threatened to turn our brains into ash. But as I looked at the shimmering map of the estate I had memorized over a decade of silent observation, I remembered the Devil's Throat, a hidden high mineral waterfall at the edge of the property, where the runoff from the limestone cliffs created a natural pool of hyperconductive water. The water, I gasped, my voice sounding like gravel under a boot. If we can reach the falls, we can use the mineral salt to ground the signal and short out the implants before the drones lock our vitals. We stumbled through the thicket, our bodies jerking with every microshock Julian sent through the geofence. A procession of ghosts moving toward the roar of the crashing water that sounded like the only mercy left in this godless forest. The drones were overhead now, their spotlights sweeping the forest floor in wide, hungry circles, and I could hear the distant, mechanical thrum of Julian's all-terrain vehicle tearing through the underbrush behind us, coming to reclaim his damaged property. We reached the edge of the precipice, just as the neural shock reached a level that made my vision bloom into white sparks. And without a second of hesitation, I grabbed Sarah's hand and led the chain of women into the icy, churning basin beneath the falls. The shock of the cold was a different kind of violence, but as the mineral-rich water surged over our skin and seeped into our pores, I held the master diamond high, letting the waterfall's massive kinetic energy act as a lightning rod. I jammed the stone against the jagged rocks where the water hit the hardest, creating a localized electromagnetic surge that turned the pool into a shimmering, blue-tinged cauldron of raw energy. For a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, we were the conduit. Electricity danced between our fingertips, and the water hissed as it met the heat of the short-circuiting implants at the base of our skulls. Final, blinding flash of blue light erupted from the center of the pool, followed by a series of tiny, muffled pops. The sound of Julian's invisible leashes finally snapping under the strain of the Earth's own power. The silence that followed was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard, broken only by the natural roar of the falls, as the drones above us suddenly began to spin out of control, their tracking signals fried by the same surge that had set us free. We pulled ourselves onto the muddy bank, shivering and scarred, but finally, truly silent in the house of the world. Just as Julian's headlights cut through the trees at the top of the cliff, his silhouette looking down at the empty, churning water as he realized that his collection had finally slipped beneath the surface of his control. We didn't just run, we moved with the calculated silence of creatures that had spent a decade being watched. And as the headlights of Julian's vehicle swept the trees above us, I led the women toward the old hunting lodge, a rotting cedar structure at the far north of the estate that Julian considered an eyesore, a place too imperfect for him to ever visit. My name is Janet, and in that moment, I wasn't just a 60-year-old survivor. I was the architect of a masterpiece he would never be able to hang on a wall. We reached the cabin, its wood smelling of damp earth and ancient dust, and within seconds, the living chain transformed into a tactical unit. We knew Julian's ego was his true leash. He wouldn't call the police because you don't report stolen art that the world doesn't know exists. He would come for us himself, driven by the obsessive need to put his gallery back in order. Using the last of my master key's energy, I didn't try to hide our trail. I did the opposite, bleeding a faint, rhythmic signal from the cracked diamond to lead him straight into the center of the lodge. Sarah and I worked in the shadows, rigging the cabin's old gas lines and the heavy iron chandelier with the same high-tensile wire Julian had once used to display his sculptures. We were no longer pieces of a collection. We were the trap. As the roar of his engine cut out in the clearing and the heavy door of the lodge creaked open, Julian stepped into the dim moonlight, looking disheveled for the first time in his life, his pristine suit torn and his eyes wide with a manic, flickering desperation. "Janet," he called out, his voice a haunting mix of pleading and threat. "Don't make me destroy you. A masterpiece can be restored, but only if the frame is intact." I stood at the top of the loft, visible just enough to draw him to the center of the room, my heart beating with a cold, steady rhythm that had nothing to do with fear. I waited until his foot hit the pressure-sensitive board we'd loosened, and as he looked up, the realization of his own mortality finally cracked his marble facade. Wire snapped, and the heavy iron weight of his own history came crashing down, not to kill him, but to pin him to the floor of the one place he couldn't control. We stood over him, 6 women who had been archived by his hand, and for the first time, I saw the predator look at us and see human beings, and the terror in his eyes was the most beautiful thing I had ever curated. We didn't waste another second. As the lodge began to groan under the weight of the sabotaged gas lines, we turned our backs on the man who had stolen our years and ran toward the border of the estate, where the real world, messy, aging, and free, was waiting to take us back. The forest finally vomited us out onto the shoulder of the interstate, a jagged gray ribbon of asphalt that looked like a scar across the earth. But to us, it was the most beautiful sight in the world because it meant we were no longer on Julian's map. My name is Janet, and as I stood there with the wind whipping my silver hair into my eyes, I realized the hunt hadn't ended at the lodge. It had just changed shape, because while Julian was pinned under the weight of his own hubris, his private security team, a group of mercenaries who were paid to keep his secrets buried as deep as the archive, were already closing in. We could see the high-beam headlights of 3 black SUVs cresting the hill behind us, moving with a predatory synchronization that made my blood run cold. And I knew that if we didn't get off this road in the next 60 seconds, we wouldn't be archived, we would be eliminated. I stepped into the middle of the lane, my heart a drumbeat of pure defiance, and raised my arms to the sky as a massive 18-wheeler came barreling toward us. Its horn a deafening, metallic scream that shook the very ground under my feet. The driver slammed on his brakes, the smell of burning rubber filling the night air like a ritual sacrifice. And as the truck skidded to a halt inches from my chest, I didn't see a stranger. I saw a lifeline. "Help us," I screamed, my voice cracking against the roar of the engine. "There are men coming who don't think we exist." The driver, a man with a face like weathered leather, looked at our tattered silk dresses and the scorched diamonds still clinging to our necks, and he didn't ask questions. He reached over and threw open the passenger door, just as the first SUV screeched onto the shoulder, doors flying open to reveal men with tactical headsets and silenced weapons. We scrambled into the cab, a tangle of limbs and desperate gasps as the driver shifted into gear and the massive engine groaned under the strain of a rapid escape. I looked into the side mirror and saw the security team standing on the asphalt, their silhouettes shrinking into the distance as we surged forward into the dark. But the relief was short-lived when I noticed a small, steady red light blinking on the dashboard of the truck. Julian's influence didn't stop at the property line. He had a kill switch on every satellite-linked vehicle in the county. And as the truck's engine began to sputter, and the electronic locks on the doors clicked shut with a familiar, chilling finality, I realized we hadn't escaped the gallery. We had just moved into a faster, more dangerous display case, and the road ahead was about to become a dead end. The engine gave a sickening, guttural cough, the kind of sound a machine makes when its heart is being remotely strangled. And as the speedometer needle began its slow, inevitable crawl towards zero, the silence in the cab became more terrifying than the roar of the wind. "My name is Janet," and I looked at the driver, a man whose name tag read Hank, and saw the confusion in his eyes turn to a hard, cold realization as his steering wheel locked, and the dashboard lights flickered into a mocking, digital red. "What the hell is this?" he growled, fighting the dead weight of the column. "This rig is brand new. It shouldn't be dying like a dog in the middle of the road." I grabbed his arm, my fingers digging into his flannel sleeve with a strength born of a decade of suppressed rage, and pointed to the black SUVs, rapidly growing larger in the rearview mirror. "They aren't just men, Hank, and this isn't a mechanical failure. It's a Billionaire's remote kill switch," I hissed, my voice a jagged edge of desperation and command. "The man I was married to owns the satellites this truck uses to breathe, and he's currently deleting our existence from the grid. If you don't help me bypass the digital brain of this truck right now, you're not just losing your rig, you're becoming an accidental casualty in a story that ends with all of us buried in a nameless grave." I saw the moment the fear in his eyes was replaced by a stubborn, blue-collar fury, the kind of anger Julian Vance could never understand, because he had never had to work for anything he couldn't buy. Hank reached under the dash, ripping away a plastic panel to reveal a nest of wires that looked like the nervous system of a metallic beast, and handed me a heavy-duty wire cutter from his side pocket. "I don't know who you are, lady, but no one shuts down my engine on my watch," he spit, his jaw set in a grim line as he steered the coasting, 40-ton mass of steel toward the gravel shoulder. I knew Sarah was watching me, her breath hitched in her throat, as I took the tool and looked for the primary GPS uplink cable, the silver wire that Sarah had described in her notes as the umbilical cord for remote overrides. The SUVs were seconds away now, the glare of their high beams filling the cab with a blinding, hostile light. And I realized that if I cut the wrong wire, we'd be sitting ducks in a lightless metal box. But if I was right, we'd be ghosts in the machine. With a prayer to the women who didn't make it, I clamped the cutters down and squeezed, a shower of sparks biting into my palms as the digital display on the dash went black. And for one heartbeat, the world was silent, and with a thunderous, mechanical roar that felt like a lion waking from a drugged sleep, the engine turned over, the manual override kicked in, and the truck lunged forward with a surge of raw, unmonitored power that sent us screaming into the night, leaving the digital tether of Julian's empire far behind in the dust of the highway. The skyline of the city rose up like a jagged wall of glass and neon, a sprawling, chaotic organism that was the polar opposite of the sterile, controlled silence of the Vance estate as Hank's truck hissed to a stop at the edge of a bustling transit hub. The sheer sensory overload of thousands of people, screaming sirens, and the smell of street food hit us like a physical wave. My name is Janet, and as I stepped onto the concrete, I felt a strange, dizzying sense of invisibility. For the first time in years, I wasn't a masterpiece on a pedestal. I was just another face in a crowd of millions, but the safety of the masses was an illusion. I knew Julian's reach extended into the very infrastructure of this city, and his security team would be using facial recognition software to scan every sidewalk and subway entrance within a 5-mile radius. We have to shed the silk, I whispered to the other women, looking at our tattered, expensive gowns that marked us as targets in this world of denim and grit. We ducked into a crowded 24-hour laundromat, our movements synchronized by the living chain instinct we'd forged in the dark, and traded our scorched diamonds and designer rags for discarded hoodies and oversized coats left in the lost and found bins. We weren't the elegant collection of item numbers anymore. We were a group of weary, anonymous travelers blending into the shadows of the late-night commuters. Sarah pointed to a massive digital billboard towering over the square, where Julian's face suddenly appeared, looking calm and concerned in a pre-recorded public safety announcement about a group of confused patients who had wandered away from a private medical facility. It was using the city's own heartbeat against us, turning every citizen into an unwitting bounty hunter. We moved through the crowded terminal, our heads down, our hearts racing in time with the flickering fluorescent lights, heading toward the one place Julian's high-tech surveillance couldn't fully penetrate, the subterranean maze of the old tunnels where the city's forgotten lived. We were deep in the belly of the beast now, the noise of the world acting as our camouflage. But as we reached the entrance to the lower levels, I saw a flash of silver in the reflection of a shop window. It wasn't a camera. It was the clinical, cold eyes of Julian himself, standing on the mezzanine above us, a tablet in his hand, and a look of terrifying triumph on his face. He hadn't just tracked us, he had predicted us, and as he raised his hand to signal the men closing in from the exits, I realized the city wasn't our hiding place. It was the final gallery where he intended to finish his work. The air in the abandoned subway tunnels was thick with the scent of damp rust and a century of forgotten echoes, a hollowed-out world that lived beneath the feet of the glittering city above. My name is Janet. And as we descended into the lightless veins of the underground, the living chain didn't break. It tightened, our breathing harmonizing in the dark as we moved toward the heart of the transit hub. But the silence was shattered by the rhythmic, metallic clicking of Julian's polished shoes on the concrete. A sound so out of place in this world of decay that it felt like a surgical incision. He emerged from the shadows of a rusted pillar, the blue light of his tablet illuminating a face that had finally shed its mask of civility. He looked hollowed out, a man whose soul had been replaced by the cold logic of an inventory list. "You've led me to a very dusty basement, Janet," he remarked, his voice echoing through the vaulted tunnels with a chilling, melodic calm. "But even in the dark, a diamond is still a diamond, and I won't allow mine to be lost in the filth." Behind him, his security team fanned out, their weapons drawn, blocking the only exits with a clinical efficiency that signaled the end of our flight. But Julian had forgotten one crucial detail. He was used to controlling environments he had built, but down here, in the rotting gut of the city, the rules were written by the discarded and the broken. I looked at Sarah, and with a silent nod, we executed the final move of our own design. We didn't reach for weapons. We reached for the exposed, high-voltage lines of the old third rail that Sarah had identified as our only leverage. As Julian stepped forward to reclaim his property, I slammed the master diamond, the last physical piece of his empire, into the open transformer box we had prepped. The resulting explosion didn't just kill the lights, it created a localized EMP that fried every piece of high-tech surveillance and weaponry in the tunnel, leaving Julian and his men blind and powerless in a world they didn't understand. In the sudden, absolute darkness, we weren't the prey anymore. We were the ghosts who knew how to navigate the shadows. I felt Julian's hand grasp for my throat, but I wasn't there. I was the darkness itself. With a collective push of our combined strength, we didn't strike him. We simply let the weight of his own obsession pull him into the path of the oncoming, automated maintenance train that hissed through the tunnel. The last thing I saw was his look of pure, unadulterated shock as he realized that some things can never be archived. And as the train's roar swallowed his final cry, the chain of women moved toward the ladder leading to the surface, where the sun was finally beginning to rise over a world that was no longer his. The climb up the rusted emergency ladder felt like a slow ascent from the grave, which rung a mile further from the sterile tomb of the Vance estate, and the suffocating weight of being a masterpiece. As I pushed open the heavy iron street grate, the first rays of a true December sun hit my face, not the artificial, curated light of a gallery, but a raw, blinding gold that felt like a baptism. "My name is Janet," and as I helped Sarah and the others onto the sidewalk of the waking city, the living chain finally loosened, not because we were broken, but because we were finally free to be individuals again. We stood on the corner of a world that had no idea we had been missing. 6 women in tattered hoodies and scorched spirits, watching the city pulse with the messy, beautiful chaos of life. But our work wasn't finished with Julian's fall in the tunnels. The empire he built was a digital fortress of NDAs, offshore accounts, and encrypted lies that needed to be razed to the ground. Sarah pulled the backup drive she had salvaged from the archive, the black box of Julian's crimes, and we walked together into the lobby of the city's largest news syndicate, a collective of ghosts ready to speak. For the next 12 hours, the world watched as the Vance collection became a global reckoning. We didn't just reveal the archive, we shared the names and the stories of every woman he had tried to erase, turning his private gallery into a public monument of survival. By nightfall, the federal authorities were seizing the estate. The pods were being dismantled, and the name Julian Vance was being scrubbed from the boards of museums and charities alike, replaced by the testimonies of the women who outlived him. I sat on a park bench as the first snow of winter began to fall. Looking at my hands, they were wrinkled, scarred, and 60 years old. And for the first time in a decade, I found them absolutely perfect. I wasn't an item number anymore. I was a woman with a future, a past, and a heart that beat to its own rhythm. Sarah sat down beside me, her eyes reflecting the city lights, and we didn't talk about the archive or the dark. We talked about the coffee we were going to buy and the places we were going to travel where no one would ever ask us to stand still. Julian had tried to freeze time to keep us beautiful, but as I watched the snow melt on my palm, I realized that the only true beauty is the kind that changes, fades, and lives. The archive was closed. The museum was in ashes. And for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was meant to be, lost in the crowd and found in myself.